Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 3 of Assessment Day. And my name is Andi Finley, and I'm the Assistant Dean in Health Sciences for Assessment and Curriculum. And it's nice to see so many people here on a Friday, and it looks like the weather is wonderful. So we will try to get you some information that you need for assessment, and then we'll kind of get you out to enjoy your weekend. So today I'm going to be presenting with Shane Howell, and I'm going to start off the presentation, and then I will move it over to Shane. And so I don't know how many of you have already been in the other sessions, but the other 2 sessions, we've kind of ramped them. So everything kind of ramps up in its complexity as we're kind of leading through assessment. And so we are doing assessment session number 3, which is next steps, which is data analysis, action plans, and closing the loop, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about those terms. We're going to kind of explain to you, I don't know if this is an official way to do it, but when Shane and I, we actually missed the meeting when we were assigned this topic. So I think we were being punished. But when we got this, I kind of thought, how are we going to start this? And so I decided we would start with some pretty basic things. And then I'm going to give you an example of kind of how I go about data analysis. And then we'll switch over and let Shane talk about action plans and closing the loop. So by the end of today, we are hoping that you will be able to analyze program data, write effective action plans for continuous improvement. We're going to follow really the bullet points down here on our agenda, and we will progress through, at least in my mind and in Shane's mind, the way to kind of approach data analysis and closing the loop and action plans. You've probably seen this slide before. It is on our LibGuides, and you've probably seen it in other sessions today. We're really going to be focusing on items 3 and 4. So obviously, if you've been in the first few sessions, and if not, I'll kind of jump in there and tell you what they talked about. But they talked about when you're doing assessments, of course, it is vital that you come up with what the expectations are. What is it that you expect your students to know? And how are you going to measure that they know those? That's really what's happening in step number 1. In step number 2, then we really need ample opportunities for students to learn whatever it is that you're teaching. That's our goals as instructors, to make sure our students have the information and the tools they need to be successful. And it is our responsibility to make sure that we don't give them some heavy, hard, difficult concept, and then we don't allow them to practice that concept. And instead, we just give them a big test without any practice. I wouldn't want someone to do that for me. So we really need to focus on opportunities, which is number 2. And then this is where Shane and I are going to pick up, which is 3 and 4, which once we do assessments for students, how do we gather this improvement, or how do we gather this information, and then how do we use that for improvement for our student learning and our programs? This is why this is important. There's benefits to trending data. And, we often hear, I'm sure everyone on the assessment in the assessment world hears, why do we do this? It takes so much time. There's a tremendous amount of benefits to assessment and tracking information. And so if we look at it in this way, we can start with administration. We need to be able to prove we're teaching what we say we're teaching. And we can prove that if we have a good assessment plan. We can show our administrators, this is what we value in the information from our programs, and we're actually achieving that. And so that's a good way for our administrators to see that this is a really worthy program. They can allocate resources. If we were to see, I'm in health sciences, so I'll use a health science example. If we had a situation to where all of our students were failing competencies on mechanical ventilation, then I might be able to trend assessment data, show that to administration and say, we need a ventilator for our labs. Our students can't learn it if they can't see it. And that also goes along with supporting ongoing efforts to make sure that the programs, administration can give the programs what they need to be successful. For students, assessment allows us the ability to give them feedback. If they're struggling, we can help them before it's too late. We can make learning pathways to make different concepts come together for them to understand it. And we can plan learning activities that help support what they need. And then for the faculty, we can use predictive analytics. You can kind of see a train wreck happening. If your assessment plan is robust, you'll be able to see, oh, this isn't going to end well by the final exam, and make some changes to what you're doing prior to that final exam. And it gives us the opportunity to improve our teaching techniques, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then it provides actionable feedback items for us, things that we might need to change. Okay, so for data analysis, for us to kind of go through what we're going to do today, we're going to have a make-up assignment. So I'm making up an assignment. It doesn't matter what your program of study is. We're going to ask our students to do an opinion piece about whatever their topic is, whether it's medicine, whether it's welding, whatever it is. We're going to ask them to write an opinion piece about something. They're going to have 3 supporting facts, details. We give them their assignment. We then go through and we have decided that the justification for their opinion, we're going to give them 20 points for that. We're going to say their introduction and conclusion is worth 10 points. The structure of their paper is going to be 10, and how they link everything together, we're going to give them 10. Okay? Now, before we give them this assignment, there's a few things we need to do. We've kind of come up with the point structure of how we're going to grade this. But we have to figure out what is an introduction and conclusion, what makes a good one. So you have to decide as an instructor, what do I think meets this criteria and what doesn't meet it? Well, that's kind of good, but it's not great, but it's not terrible. You've got to come up with these criteria, and you can't keep it a secret. We've got to tell the students what we expect them to do to be successful. So when you come up with whatever this magic is for your students to do wonderful, then they need to know what your expectation is. Okay, so let's say we give them their assignment, you get it back, and you grade it based on the criteria that you have shared with the students about what is expected, what you consider to be wonderful and kind of okay and not so great. And what I do is I put it in a grid. So if you look at this grid, then you're going to have students in one column. Now, I didn't put names down the column, but where you have the numbers 1 through 15 right there, those represent individual students. Across the top, the same justifications or the same criteria that we used for grading this paper now appear at the top with the points that we're assigned. Okay? And then as I have graded each student, then I put student number 1, they got 13 points for justification. They got 7.5 for their introduction and conclusion. So I go all the way across for every student. Okay, so this is the way I start my analysis. Now there's things I need to start looking for. I need to start looking for trends. Are there things our students are doing that are really great? Are there things which, we could probably do that better? And I ask myself some questions. I ask it on the student level. Oh goodness, is anybody in trouble? Who needs my help? Maybe there's some topics that, God, it looks like everybody didn't do so great with this topic. And then I also color code them. So I start by color coding. This is the same criteria up top, same students, same grades. Then I go through a color coding system, and because my mind is simplistic, I just use red, yellow, green. So if I have students that do really well, you know, and I'm like, they're pretty proficient at this, they're doing pretty good, then I color them green. If they're in that, you know, they still passed, and I'm assuming 70s passing here, you might have to change that for your individual program. But if, you know, they're passing, but they're on the bubble, you know, I need to watch them. I'm a little nervous about this. And then red is anybody that actually didn't pass, that fell below the 70 benchmark. And then I color code them based on their individual grade. So that gives me, at the very least, a little bit of heartburn if this were a real situation. And this is where my heartburn would come from. I almost had 50% of my class that failed this assignment. So then that begs the question, is my assignment messed up? Did I do a terrible job teaching this? Could I have done a better job? Is this a weak group of students? I don't know. Maybe my directions were not very well. When we said we were going to do this opinion piece, maybe I did not give clear expectations, but this would bother me if I saw this. So I would immediately have some red flags go up. Now, I would analyze this a little bit further, because this gives me a pretty global view of the assignment. But then I break it down even further and go under each category and use that same red, yellow, or green based on the same percentage criteria. And then I do it for each category. So when I do that, like for example, if we look under justification, something was wrong with either the way they understand how to justify their opinion, or the way I'm grading how they justify their opinion. But there's a lot of people that fell short in justification. Conversely, with introduction and conclusion, hey, they get it. Everybody in the class did really well on that part of this assignment. But then this allows me to not just look at an overall of how the students did, but now I can use assessment to jump into two different things. Individual students, as far as, do I need to help Susie understand linking phrases and ideas? Does she need some help? Or it tells me collectively to kind of modify my teaching. You know, we have a lot of people that have been teaching a long time, and, you know, they may be using the same PowerPoint they used 15 years ago. That may not be the best method. You know, if for us to be effective instructors, we have to use the feedback of what we're getting from assessment analysis to change what we're doing. What we did 15 years ago probably doesn't work with the students we're seeing today, because they're a completely different, the way they learn is different. So we have to kind of modify what we're doing to adjust to each individual student and their learning. Now, I'm not saying that this is the way you need to do everything. I'm saying this is the way I do it. I'm sure there are multiple ways to do it. But this is kind of my approach to assessment and really looking at information, is I try to let it guide me to make good decisions for the student and better decisions for what I do. If I had half the students fail something for me, I would think I need to do a better job. Something's not right. And then the analysis part of it would be figuring out, well, what's not right? So with that, I'm going to pass this over to Shane, and he is going to talk to you about how to start the conversation with yourself about what you need to do.
All right, thank you, Andy. I want to make a quick comment that's not slide based in regards to what you're showcasing, which is you're admitting the fact that as teachers, we are all already grading. So in the grading mechanism, we've got these tools and processes. And I think a lot of time assessment is so scary because we feel like it's another thing that's out there and it's another process that we have to do. And we're already professionals at grading. So what you're showing us is a way that allows us to use our grading mechanism to also then give us the information we need for assessment, which I really appreciate, because a lot of times it feels like it's an extra thing, but we really already have it built into our processes. But with that, the conversation side, when you've got that data, and on screen, I know that there's a lot of words on each of these screens. So I think for my portion, I think the real value in this is that you can make a screen grab of any one of these and or maybe even print them later. But the conversation, it's obvious when you've got the information that you've got to figure out if you should be changing something. But you can only do that when you're able to dig in enough to know why something, you have to understand why there might be a problem. And a lot of times that means you have to be talking about the tools, you have to be talking about the student learning. And when we are looking at that, if you could jump to the next slide, the ultimate goal in the conversation is to get us to where we can have something that's an action plan. So in the tools that we're looking at and the process of all of this, when you at the professor level are trying to complete the assessment, you have to have an action plan, and you end up having to have this thing that's closing the loop. The closing the loop statement ends up being this sort of mantra that we hear so much. And I'm going to make sure that we address both of these in some good examples in the next several slides. But in it, the loop that we get into is this cycle that you keep seeing in all the presentations today. But writing the action plan itself, go ahead and jump to the next slide for me, Andy. These are ideally going to be statements that are addressing specific things and the changes that you need in an area. Now, a lot of times there's a tension that's here. You know, I've got to write an action plan. It feels like I've done something wrong. And my punishment is I have to write a statement that admits the fact that I failed. So the idea of that, and honestly, the first several years that I was really invested in assessment, I was putting on myself this punitive feature. And it was only really after getting past a few years of it that I started to see the value of it enough that I realized it's not that I had failed in the curriculum. It's just it's another tool, you know, in the same way that when we're grading. So we have to act on those results, and we're looking for ways to make, you know, the small things in the classroom better that end up making the program better, that also give us a way to track and prove that we're engaging and doing and making those adjustments. So even when you get something that's a disappointment in the data, you are then just asking yourself, well, what is it that's driving that? And we admit, you've got to make some guesses. Andy, next slide. So there's several slides coming, and the consider these slides will help you if you had that right now in your own data. You know something's there. If you have these lists that are these next several slides, at least you have a benchmark to look back at something that says, okay, that could be a point where I can dig in, or that can be a point where I can dig in. We're going to take questions if you have anything specifically that you'd like to ask us about how it might correlate to your programs. But specifically here, if there is something in a, you know, that defensive state, it's like, oh my gosh, we failed in that, and you know, that target wasn't met, and it's got to be something in the classroom, or it's got to be something in the teaching. Well, there's bigger purposes out there too. Things like the admission requirements. I mean, you can really step back and ask yourself, is the entire holistic component, not just that one thing in the one classroom? You can look broader than that in terms of across your curriculum and even across the college. So something to just consider. The assessment tool itself, is it appropriate? Is the way you're even trying to measure it appropriate? So if you're just looking for a way to keep it from being so personal about, oh my goodness, we failed that way in that class, look a little bit bigger. Or Andy, next screen. The curriculum revision mode is about the things that make the most sense to us. We're teaching, we're in the classroom. I think one of the things that's weird is a lot of times in assessment, we may not be the person in the classroom. We may only be helping with the data side of it. So it's a fair question to be asking the professors, the boots on the ground. How is the delivery mode? Is it really adequate? And in the honesty of that question, if they have some answers that say, I would really like to change this up, there's your action plan. It doesn't have to be overwhelming and it doesn't have to be punitive. It's just an acknowledgement that here's part of this process. And this is something we would like to try to see if it actually makes a difference. Now, in that, you could also be asking about the professional standards inside the curriculum, if you need to make it more specific or not, or even the outcomes in terms of whether or not they need more attention. A lot of times the idea of curriculum mapping can help to show this, but the idea of even more attention or less, I can remember very specifically in one of my own curriculum, one of our action plans one year was simply the fact I was going to make sure the students knew that we were going to be using it and that we were assessing it. By me taking the time in class to point out that this is important, we really want you to do well on it, and here's the criteria. By us doing that in the classroom, it showed the data from one year to the next. That was all they needed. But if we were assessing them on something and not explaining the fact that we were going to be using it, it didn't seem to be important. So just the acknowledgement of it was a way to, and that was our action plan one year. We were just going to share and make it as transparent as possible. And then the next year, the data increased. So it sort of makes sense. If we just share it with them, let them know what's coming. Next slide, please. Another thing to consider is, do we know for sure that the program's expectations are fair? Are the faculty needing more development? And these are all things that in the conversations in a room, again, as a bullet point, if you're a department head or an APD and you're trying to drive this train, this is a fair question to ask, not even knowing the answer, but you put it into a room with eight other faculty, and you just say, do you feel like we need some development that's going to help this? And you'll get answers. And again, any of those answers, single, honest, direct things can be your action plan. So you can just pick up that conversation and fold it back in. Next slide. I pulled this graphic straight from the LibGuide, which is available. The bad thing is there's a lot of stuff out there. And so sometimes it's just overwhelming finding it. So I thought this one was worth it, mostly because it puts me through a little checklist. This one's one that I think is worth printing because it helps you to target. If you're writing an action plan, you can go any one of these avenues and combine it with any of these other considerations that I've just shown in the previous 5 or 6 slides. And all of a sudden you have a very simple and direct action plan. So finally, next slide. When we get to the actual writing, the thing that will make it, I guess, most effective, make action plans simple, make them direct. You need to be able to address specific area of concern. You've already admitted that you've got something you're wanting to try to do. You've figured that much out. If you're doing that, decide if you're trying to hit a specific target, and if you can, you have to say it out loud, and if you can, you need to quantify it. You also must commit yourself to a timeline that has a deadline. I write an actual date in every action plan with every specific target. In doing that, I immediately follow it up with another little sentence that says, we are tapping these faculty to help address it. And we had to start doing that because I found early on in assessment that we would all gather, we would talk about it as a group, we would agree we had a way to kind of address it. But then if no one had their name associated with it, it's sort of a thing that just, did you do that this year? Did you do that? Oh, no, you didn't do that. I thought you were going to do it. So as long as you are in that room, just acknowledge who is going to be mostly responsible to make sure that that gets done again. And this will help to make sure that that known resource is also available. If those faculty feel like their name is associated with it, you'll probably start hearing, but oh, I need this, or can I get that? And sometimes as a department head or an APD, that's the best time to go ahead and acknowledge it's going to take effort. Why don't we look at, is this something that should be part of your FPMS? Is it something that could become an objective? How big of a deal is it? How minor of a deal is it? And again, getting it all out in the open and being really transparent means you can get all of those concerns, and you get people that are going to be committed to getting it done. In the writing, next slide, then the idea is you need to share it back with the faculty that are going to be responsible. And so this slide is almost a exact repeat. You just have to talk about it and make sure it gets shared. You need to bring it back up again. For me, the way that I make sure that happens is every year in an FPMS cycle, we always do a planning stage. So as a planning stage, is anybody's name associated with something that's on an action plan? Let's talk about that, because the planning stage means that you get to commit early in the academic year to things that you know is upcoming. That's also another point that might be a valuable opportunity for the department head to know. We need these physical resources, or we need these support systems. And so all of that, again, is a way to kind of fold in a good cycle of things that seems like it's just the end of this loop, right? The whole action plan thing gets folded up into all of this. If you just build it into some of these hard dates and part of our existing way of getting through the academic year anyway, then I think you'll find that you've got some safety nets built in. Again, next slide. So in it, the next year comes back around. You've got an action plan written, and you got to go through all of this again. In the going through it all again, one thing we haven't addressed yet, okay, I've wrote an action plan, but what is that whole closing of the loop? So if you'll jump again to the next slide, that's when you really actually have to implement and do and reassess. And then all of this layering of the stuff that we did last year is built into a cycle of things where we're redoing those things. So you're looking at that data again. You have to segregate everything. You have to see if there are any problems. You also have to commit yourself to answering the question of, if there was something we wanted to do, did we actually try to do it? And then what was that data? Eventually, next slide, we'll get to then write a new action plan. So in the cycle of things, the closing of the loop is not really year one. It's sort of a year two activity. That means you're acknowledging the fact that you did address, as you intended to, a point of concern. If you've done that, I recommend just taking the formulistic approach again. Admit who was responsible, admit what the deadline was, and acknowledge. And I find the closing the loop statements for me are very short. Yes, we did it or not. These were the people involved, and here's the data number. And then you're just saying, yes, we met it, and our efforts were worth the effort. Or you can say, we didn't meet it, and now we have to evaluate whether or not we're going to continue to assess it. Do we try to fix it a different way? And that goes back to those other 6 slides. You have to then step back again, go back into the conversation mode. So the closing the loop really only occurs in year 2 in response to year 1. Sometimes it might even be year 3 in response to year 1, depending on if the actual target gets met. If you include that follow-up, little short follow-up statement every year in your processing of your cycle, then you'll be able to see that it's easy to build in these formulas for a way to make sure that you've addressed a specific target, who was responsible, what is the timeline. That's closing the loop. If you've got those acknowledgments, whether or not they're met, gives you a formula for how do I just simply make sure that I've got the checks in the boxes. And then each year it does fold into itself. It does seem like you never might get to turn it all off. But really, if you meet or not a particular target, it only either opens a new action plan for you for the next year, or you get an acknowledgement that says we were able to meet it, what we experimented with worked. And then hopefully those particular percents, you're seeing the data, And then ultimately you get the benefit of having trends and being able to look back. And I think all of this simply means that faculty will find that what happens in the classroom does have direct impact. And if we can close loops within a year or two, everybody's on board and it's in their memory enough that we know that we're doing something valuable. So, but by leaving things not closed, it may as well not happen. If you say you're going to do it and then you just leave it out there and then it doesn't ever get done and nobody's invested, then really the assessment falls apart to the point that you're really only trying to provide data just to provide data. So the assessment and closing the loop, and if we can go to this next slide, the idea being that what we're going to actually do with the loop is just admit we've got here, we've addressed it, we're either successful or not. And I hope that all of these, again, with a lot of bullet points and a lot of text on the pages, just give you a way to work through what is something at a department level or a program level. And sometimes this might be something where you're able to have conversations with just 2 or 3 faculty, but you can pull in a whole room of people, go through the checklist, and you'll have ways to get at answers. Oh, we made it to the question slide. All right, Andy, you got to jump back in. I'm going to open it up. Anybody see something or would like any type of, we'll take anything, I guess. This is the closing of the, we'll do our best to answer questions for anything.
Well, that sounds promising, I guess.
Well, I just wanted to say, Shane, I was glad that you keyed into, like, it's okay if you didn't make your goal or whatever your commitment was for your assessment, because I think a lot of people think like we have to meet everything, and that's not really the goal, is to meet everything. It's okay if you don't. It's good to like regroup, look at the assessment. Is that the right assessment for what you're trying to accomplish? If it is, what can you do to better your scores in the future? Or, what can you do to help your students learn? So I think that is a key here, because everybody thinks we have to meet everything, and it's not necessarily always that. And the action plan isn't a bad thing. It is more work. So people think they want to meet things so they don't have to do an action plan, but the action plan is actually a good reflection of what you're doing and what you could be doing. So just to make your program better, and we all want to make our programs the best that we can. So I think that's what we need to key into. So
I think one of the things that most professors, if you stick them in a room, they're going to talk about the very things that we're doing. And through an assessment cycle like this, they're going to talk about what's working, what's not working. I find what is a little tricky in it is being mindful enough to record, not necessarily physically record, but write down a couple of things of what happens there. Because most often we're very aware, or at least potentially know that if we try something, it might have an impact. But to close the loop, you have to be mindful enough to write it into your action plan. That way, next year you've got the excuse to report on what you've done. The people in the room know the answers, and they normally know if they've had an impact, but you've got to get it out of them.
And to your point, Lacey, I think it's important to know that if you've got objectives and measures and things that you have consistently met year after year after year, you need to change them. That's something that you've accomplished, pick something else. So it defeats the purpose really of doing an assessment and really evaluating it if it's written to that you're going to meet everything. That's not the sign of a good assessment plan. It's probably a sign of the opposite. Actually, it's really more concerning to me to see an assessment plan year after year after year that everything is met and the assessment plan is not changed. That actually brings up way more concerns for me than seeing that something's not met and then having a action plan that's actually meaningful and is strategic in trying to correct that. Are there any other questions or statements?
I can't believe we got through all those slides that fast.
I don't have a question, but I would like to say this has been a great presentation. I want to thank both of you for it. This has been really good stuff.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
so
Thank
much.
you.
It's nice to get to do something that you feel like may have an impact. But assessment is just an entire day like this. There's so much information, and it always, even in doing it, it always seems overwhelming. It just is like, it always seems so big. I appreciate that there's ways to get at it. I like looking at things in terms of processes. So just try to build some mechanisms that keep it going well.
And assessment really, as Shane had mentioned earlier, people do assessment in their teaching routinely. It's putting it on paper, and then everybody had like a fit but really you do this all the time. So assessment isn't creating anything new. It's just putting on paper what you do, and kind of learning from what you do and giving the students what they need. And I went to a SACS conference. I don't know, it was before COVID. I don't know how long COVID's been now, but it's probably been 3 years ago since I've been to that conference. And it was with people all over. And we had a very healthy, robust assessment plan, comparatively speaking. And these were medical universities and big name universities. And I would stack our assessment plan up to any of those of the people that I spoke with. And they asked me, when they heard what all we were doing, they just seemed to be totally like, I just cannot believe y'all do that. But it's so beneficial, and I've certainly seen the benefits of it. And it did feel like at first that things were just layering on, and it just was one more thing. But it really is what's best for the student. A beautiful assessment plan is extremely beneficial to anyone involved in it.
So anyone else want to chime in? Well,
No one else.
I'll return it back to Renee.
I want to say thank you to all of our presenters today, Catherine, Lee, Kim, Deborah, Shane, and Andy, and then all of our panelists that were on as well. Thank you for taking the time today to spend time in assessment. It's a word that we all want to run through most of the time, but I think hearing examples from folks, how they're using it, has been helpful. So I hope you enjoyed the day. We will get these recordings out. So look, if you weren't in Lee and Catherine's session at the beginning, they will be sending out information next week with links, as well as in their newsletter. And we should have these on the LibGuide site soon too. So we wish you all a very happy weekend. Enjoy, and we'll see you back here Monday.
Bye.
Bye.